Welcome back to dinanddaf. This is Elana Stein Hain. Today we are going to talk about the Korban Oleh v'yored, the graduated Korban, meaning the Korban that goes up and down. If you have more income, you bring X. If you have less income, you can bring something that's less expensive. This Korban shows up at the beginning of Masechet Shevuot because the beginning of Masechet Shevuot talks about many things that are two that are four, meaning the original two show up very clearly in the Torah. And then Chazal understand that there's another two that are parallel to it. And a set of two that are four are Yediot HaTum'ah, right? We know from the Torah the situation where B'shogeg, by accident, somebody who doesn't know that they are ritually impure goes into the Mikdash or eats kachim. And Chazal say, same thing applies to another two situations, which is, I know that I'm Tmeah, but I didn't realize that this was the Mikdash. I didn't realize that this thing was kachim. And there, if that is the case, if that is done B'shogeg, that is done without knowledge, then Korban Oleh v'yored. Korban Oleh v'yored is really interesting because in Perek Daled of Vayikra, there's a description of what happens if different people sin. So we talk about what a Kohen Gadol should do if they sin, what kind of Korban they're supposed to bring as their chatat. What happens if the Jewish people sin as a group, what they should bring. What happens if a Nasi sins, what's their chatat. Then what happens if a regular old Joe like myself sins? What's their chatat? And then we get to Perek Hey of Vayikra, and we start saying, well, remember how we were talking about that, regular old Joe who's supposed to give a chatat? Well, let me tell you that there are some instances where instead of just giving the chatat as you usually would do, which is a female goat or a female sheep, it may be too expensive. And so instead, you can give two birds. And if you can't afford the two birds, one will be an olah, one will be a chatat, meaning one will be fully burned and the other one will be considered a chatat and treated that way on the mizbeach. Then you can do asirit haifa of solat. You can do a tenth of an ephah of fine flour, right? So you have gradations. Now, this is mentioned only in particular regards to particular averot. And what I'm curious about is Korban Oleh trying to tell us something about the way that we should make things affordable for people? Is it trying to tell us something else about these three particular averot that people might have done? So we're going to jump in. One more piece of information. Actually, let's get to it later. Let's start with the psukim themselves in Vayikra Perek Hey. Because I don't know about you, I think that when we start Sefer Vayikra, it is very hard to take in all of the new information that is being thrown our way because we are so not used to the whole world of the Mikdash. So let's get a little more used to it. V'nefesh ki techata, if a person sins, v'shama kol Allah, and they hear the voice of a curse, v'hu eid o ra'a o yada, and that person is a witness, or they saw, or they know, im lo yagid v'nasa avono. If they don't tell, then they will bear their punishment. They will bear their sin. Essentially, they will be punished in some way, right? Now, what is this case exactly? On its face, it sounds like you just heard generally someone pronounce something and you knew something, I suppose, about what they were pronouncing and saying, if nobody tells, then there's going to be a curse on their head, and you didn't tell, well, that's a sin, okay? Chazal interpret this as this is a situation where I know some edut, I know some testimony for somebody or against somebody for that matter, and I decide not to give it. And actually, I assent to a shvuah, an oath that I don't know anything, that I can't be a witness because I don't know anything. That is one of our three mitzvot that are going, three averot, I should say, sorry, that are going to get a person into Korban Oleh v'yored territory, right? If you did that, I swore that I didn't know anything about your case. And that's a lie. The second case, okay, the second situation that brings an Oleh v'yored in its wake is a situation of Tumah, as we mentioned. O nefesh ki asher tiga B'chol davar tamei, o b'nivlat chayat me'ah, o b'nivlat behimat me'ah, o b'nivlat sheretz tamei, v'ne'elam mimenu, v'hu tamei v'ashem. Or somebody who touches something tamei. Could be an animal carcass of some sort, and v'ne'elam mimenu. They didn't remember. Their awareness was lost, as opposed to the one who seems to have, taken a false oath about not knowing, or at least said amen to a false oath about not knowing anything about the case, where he could have done that on purpose too. In the case of Tuma, it specifically says v'ne'elam mimenu. You didn't know, meaning it's only shogeg. And by the way, the next pasuk says other expansions of what kind of Tuma this might be. What's interesting here is that the pasuk doesn't say what you did, right? Meaning it just says if you became tameh and you forgot about it, and then you know about it later. So the way the Chazal interpret this is you must have done something in your forgetful state, namely walked into the Mikdash or eaten kachim, right? That's the second type of category of mitzvah, avera, really, that gets a Korban Oleh. And here's the third. It's another shvuah. It's another oath. O nefesh kiti shava levatesh visvatayim laharau lehitiv. Right? A person makes an oath that they're going to do something bad or do something good, meaning meaning they're going to do something. And again, the person forgets about it. And then they know, and they are guilty of one of these things. Now, one of these things, I assume, refers to our three above. But the point is here, the way we understand this is somebody did a Shevuot sheker. I said I was going to do something, and then I didn't do it, right? For example. Now, it is interesting that Shevuah is also one of the Stein Hain Arba in your mishnah in Shevuot, right? We say, what are the original Shevuot sheker? The original Shevuot sheker is you say, I'm going to do X, and then you don't. I'm going to do Y, and then you don't. And what's the Shehin Arba? They add, I did X, and you're lying. You swear I didn't do X, and you're lying. Okay, but that's, for neither here nor there. But it is interesting that they both show up in that mishnah. I just have to say, both Yediot Tuma and the Shevuah situation. But this is the third of the, you can give a Korban Oleh Yored. How do we know? Because take a look, they're grouped together. Pasuk. So if the person is guilty of any of these three things, they have to do vidui, right? They're going to confess what they sinned. And they're going to bring a penalty to God on the chait that they did. I know it makes it sound like now it's a korban asham, but it is categorized as a korban chatat, basically. Min hatzon kisba osiratizin lechatat. Right, so you're going to bring a female sheep or a female goat as a chatat. V'chiper lava kohen michatato, and the kohen is going to atone for you. But then comes the yored part. If you don't have enough to pay for a sheep, no problem. Bring 2 turtle doves, 2 pigeons, something much cheaper, right? One is going to be a chatat, one is going to be a fully burnt offering. A few psukim later, it then offers the next yored, the next grade down. If you can't even afford the birds, what you can bring is your korban can be asiri taifa solet lechatat. It could be 1/10 of an ephah of fine flour. You shouldn't put any of the fixings on it. It shouldn't get any oil. It shouldn't get any frankincense. Because it's a sin offering. This is not something that should be, luxurious. Let's put it that way. So that's what we have. So I asked the question again, what is this Korban Oleh Yored business about? Is it trying to save people money? And if it's just trying to save people money, why only these 3 chataim? Why are only these 3 sins of I took a false oath that I don't know things about your case, but I do, and I should be an aid. Two, I didn't know I was tamei, or I didn't know this was the mikdash, and I ate kachim, or I walked into the mikdash, right? Or I didn't know it was kachim. And three, I took a false oath, generally meaning I swore to do something or not to do something, and I didn't follow through. Okay. So why these three if it's really about saving people money? Alternatively, is it possible that it's not about saving people money? It's about these three, right? It's trying to tell you something about these three, and it's not some big, general comment about how we should try to save people money. Now, I do want to add something that somewhat complicates the situation is that elsewhere in Vayikra, we find that somebody who suffered from tzaraat, somebody who suffered from that skin scale disease, and they are going through their tahara process, they too have the possibility of bringing at least the two birds option if they can't afford the four-legged animal. They don't have the solet option, they don't have the flower option, but they do have that. Same thing with the Yoledet, same thing with a woman who's given birth to give her korban as she's going through her tahara process. Same thing, she has the option of the two birds. She doesn't have the option of the solet, but it certainly does make it interesting because what's like, why these things? Is there something about the Matzorah? Is there something about the Yoledet? Or are we talking about just in general, we want people to be able to save money? Now, you guessed it, there are really two general approaches. One approach says is about saving money. The other approach is this is about these particular instances. So I want to start with this is about these particular instances because generally speaking, if we're talking about these particular instances, people actually talk more about the three averot that the Korban Oleh comes for. And talking about those instances, we actually have to find something that is more makil about them, something that is more lenient about them. Maybe they aren't such terrible infractions, and therefore you can suffice with something less, whether because losing the money by buying the korban is somewhat of an onesh to you, or because you need a different kind of kapara and you don't need the most valuable animal for the kapara. You can have less than that, right? Like you can even think about it in terms of like the kamut, how much, the quantity, right? A four-legged animal, that's big. It's a lot of meat. Once you get to a bird, it's a little bit less. Once you get to some flour, it's a little bit less, right? So maybe your kapara is even, you need less of the thing. So I want to look at two perspectives that take the tack of it's about these averot, actually. One is Dr. Yoni Grossman, who has a book on Vayikra, which I highly recommend. I think he's just an incredible reader of Torah. He also has a number of books on Demuyot characters in the book of Bereshit. Also highly recommend. His book on Yosef is absolutely masterful. But either way, he says, here's my summary for you. Here's what these three have in common. Says even though the person didn't do anything active, because by the way, he basically, he reads the pshat of the Shama Kol Allah, that there was just a general curse of, if anybody knows Edut for this and they don't show up, and what you did is you didn't show up, right? It's a little bit different than, the way that Chazal read it, but he's saying on a pshat level, because sometimes the pshat and the drash are not the same, and you didn't show up, right? It was actually an error or a sin of omission. Same thing with Tuma and Tara. You didn't go immerse yourself to become Tehora, right? Same thing with the Shevuot checker. You promised to do something, but you didn't do it, right? Or what's interesting is like, you could also have it as you did do it, but if you promised not to do something, but you didn't do what you said. So that's the first thing. He says these are things that come from a lack of an omission. He also says, by the way, nonetheless, without, even with this omission, who paga b'hashrat shechina b'Yisrael, right? A person has actually actively harmed God's imminence, the imminence of God's presence within the Jewish people. Why? Because the Shvuah, the Allah that you heard that said, you got to come if you know Edut, was using God's name. The Shvuah that you took, that you never filled out, you using God's name. Tumata mikdash v'kodashav, obviously, right? That's the mikdash, and kudshim is supposed to be somehow, a reflection of God's immanence within the Jewish people, within the Jewish community. So it says, look, these are not as bad. They're not as severe. They're not as bad. They're not as severe as, active chait. And therefore, you have the option of doing something less instead of waiting, a half a year to put together enough money to buy yourself a kispah, to buy yourself a female sheep. You can do something lesser than this. Isn't such an intense. It's not such an intense kapara that's required. Now, the Ramban back in the Middle Ages, he also said, I think it's really about there's something more makil, there's something more lenient about these three. And he says, he says, look, the reason why the Shevuot cases, whether it's about Edud or it's just a Shevuot sheker, the reason why you can give a Korban Oleh rate is because it's not chayav karet. You don't get karet for doing those things. They're not so intensely serious. Well, what about tumat mikdash v'kadashav, which is actually karet? If we're talking about a situation of mazid, if you did it on purpose. So he says, well, I have a different reason for that. Uvetumat mikdash v'kadashav. What about defiling the mikdash and its kachim? Because the person is making a mistake as they're trying to do a mitzvah. Because after all, the kohen who's eating the sacrificial food, a person who comes to the mikdash in order to bow to God or to give a sacrifice, the person is doing a mitzvah after all. They're thinking about God. And therefore, even though they made a mistake, the Torah gives them many different options for the ability to get kapara, right? So it's kind of interesting what the Ramban does, because the Ramban adds something. It's not just about, you add something to our thinking. You might think, oh, well, when it's an error of omission, it's not as bad. That's what Dr. Grossman says. And the truth is, we talked about lav she'ein bo maaseh, right? We've been talking about doing a negative commandment or transgressing a negative commandment that doesn't have a maaseh, and whether you would get lashes for that or not, and whether that means it's actually something that's more lenient or there's a different reason, but for another time. But nonetheless, you could see the difference between doing and not doing, an error of commission and an error of omission. And for the Ramban, it's actually, well, let's look at these particular averot. Honestly, the Shevuot, it's not, usually when you give a korban chatat, when you do something b'shogeg, it's actually, you would get karet if you did it b'mezid without witnesses, right? Like, so actually these kind of don't fit, right? There's no karet for this. Okay. Now let's also remember, by the way, the shvua in terms of the edud is also if you do b'mezid here, but okay. And in terms of the tumat mikdash, I find this fascinating. He's basically saying, but you were trying to do something good. You were trying to do a mitzvah. Okay, now, of course, the Ramban gets attacked on account of, I could probably find a bunch of other things that you have to give a korban chatat for, and you don't get a korban oleh for, and you're in the middle of doing a mitzvah, right? They're actually in context of doing a mitzvah. Sure, I could probably find a few of those. But nonetheless, Ramban, like the more modern approach of Dr. Grossman, and that's really what Dr. Grossman is following up on, right? That more modern approach is actually an echo of this approach that really what we're looking at are three averot that are different from other averot. And when we think about the world of averot, not every avera is the same. Not every avera requires the same onish. Not every avera requires the same kind of kapara. Okay. I want to look at a second approach. The second approach actually just focuses more on, we're trying to save people money. And the wildest is the Abarbanel. The Abarbanel says something that la Halakha we just don't paskin. But the Abarbanel says, I think you can do a Korban Oleh for any Korban chatat, right? Interesting. It says Mimash Amar Katuv Achar Kol Zeh, and there's actually a pasuk. We didn't read this pasuk together, but it's later in Parakeh. It's after what we read in Parakeh of Vayikra. It says V'chiper Alav HaKohen Al Chatato Asher Chata Me'achat Me'ila. Right, the Kohen is going to atone for the person's chatat that they sinned from one of these. Now, what's one of these? I would have thought one of these means one of these three. He's saying, what do you mean? One of these includes everything in Perek A and includes everything in Perek Daled. Everything in Perek Daled was like any chatat you do. Are you a nasi? What's your chatat? Are you a Kohen? Are you a Kohen Gadol? What's your chatat? Are you a regular person? What's your chatat? But all of those were any chatat you have to bring for any avera. So maybe the me'ele from these goes all the way up into Perek Daled. Moreh Ra'ah Mitit, teaching us a true thing. Shema She'amar, a true law. Ve'im lo tasig yado chozer al kol minei chatat. That what's written is of if you don't have enough money, you can bring this other level of korban. It goes to all chatat. Umeasher elu ha'inyanim havim v'ikru me'od, or hovim v'ikru me'od, says these three things. Why are they mentioned with the Korban Oleh, right? Because they happen often. Umi shehu ani v'dal, and a person who is poor, lo yinatzeh me'eleh, a person will not be able to avoid ever having to give this in their lives. Honestly, even if you try your best to hold yourselves back, something will happen. Tuma will happen. Maybe you get Shevuot and you forget and you don't do it, or you're avoiding being an aid. We think it's going to happen. Then the person won't have enough money to bring korbanot for this. That's why the Torah says about these three things. If you don't, if you don't have enough, right? It really applies to everything, or it should apply to everything. But here, there's a particular concern because these things happen frequently. Now, the Sefer HaChinuch, interestingly enough, also we're going in reverse order, right? The Sefer HaChinuch, interestingly enough, talks about also how often, how often these things might happen to people. It's not that these three things are different from everything else, or that they're more makil than anything else. It's that they happen often. It says Kvar Amarnu, we said back in mitzvah 95 already. He's now in mitzvah 123, the mitzvah of Korban Oleh. Ki inyana korban laskiru lashiva chosheva libo b'koach hafala or hapeula ki hera ma'asav. Right. So we already said Korbanot are trying to help people do tshuva through something active because we did something bad that was active. And that they'll ask God for forgiveness on what's done, and they'll be careful in the future. And in God's infinite wisdom, knowing how flighty human beings are, knowing how little we understand, knowing how hard it is for us to control ourselves, God made it easy for us and said, you can get atonement for these particular chataim based on your bank account. Because they happen often, right? So he continues and says, they happen often. Think about how often, the tongue slips. So he says, obviously, it's easier to do bad with the tongue, swear that you're going to do something and then you don't do it, swear falsely. It's easier to do that than to do an actual maaseh. And when it comes into mantara, it's really hard to hold on to, when you tell me, when you tell her, going, taking care of it, you can make the mistake. It could happen that way, right? But the point is, the real goal here is people should be able to get kapara. And if we want people to be able to get kapara, we have to allow them to give something less expensive. Otherwise, they won't be able to get kapara, and that wouldn't be fair if they wouldn't have an opportunity to gain kapara. Okay, so while the Abarbanel says that goes for the whole system of chataim, meaning any sins that we do that would require a chatat, Sefer HaChinuch says it's these three things because they happen really often. Okay, but either way, it's about allowing people who have less means to be able to participate in getting kapara. So we have these two approaches. One approach that looks at these three mitzvot and says these three mitzvot are lighter, and therefore they can have a lighter korban. And another that says it's about saving people money, and maybe it's exemplary of all chatat, or maybe it's because these things happen more often. Now I want to talk for a second. What about the Yoledet and the Metzora? How do the Yoledet and the Metzora fit in here? First of all, not everybody who talks about these three averot and the Korban Oleh talks about the Yoledet and the Metzora so much in terms of the logic. But you can imagine that if you want to try to figure out, well, what would the Yoledet and the Metzora have done necessarily that requires a Korban chatat? Now, there are plenty of people who say that Korban chatat for the Yoledet is not like a sin Korban chatat, but there are other ways to read it. But nonetheless, we do say that perhaps she swore that she would never have another child in the pain of childbirth, mashu kazeh. So it's still in the category of Shevuot, right? And the Metzora, what is the Metzora being punished for? Lashon hara. So we're still in the language place, right? So if you want to say there's something lighter about these things, maybe there's no maaseh, right? Because it's just a shvua. Maybe there's no chiyuv karet, right? That kind of thing. So you could still go in that direction. Or you could say these are things that people may encounter irrespective of their financial abilities. And hopefully somebody could be a yoledet regardless of their financial ability. And, God forbid, somebody can become a metzora regardless of their financial possibilities. And instead of being punitive to them, we want to give them the opportunity to do something that can bring them back into the circle of the Jewish community one way or another. But either way, I love this as an opening for Shevuot because we are getting into the realm of talking about what your mouth can do and can't do, and how serious what it is that we say might be. So certainly focusing on an avera that relates to a shvua and whether it is offering us an opportunity to make sure that everyone can gain kapara, or it's offering us recognition that using the mouth is not as terrible necessarily, depending on what you say, I suppose, then as performing a certain act, just opens all sorts of questions about the role of speech. To be continued. Thanks, everybody.